This talk will be about routinely collected data, administrative data, and quality registers and what to do with them and how to use them. And my work with that started in 2009 when I started on my thesis using the Swedish oxygen register. And the dissertation was in 2012, and that is called SwedeVox. And I will mention that now and again. So that's a register that includes people on CPAP, home ventilator, and home oxygen. But we've got lots of registers, which we will talk about. And then last year, I was staying with a family in Adelaide, in Australia, working with David Currow there and his team. And I'm going to start off with talking a little bit about some studies we have done using data, and have that like as a backdrop to the discussion. And then to talk generally about which data sources we have in Sweden, which different types and their pros and cons. And then the process, the actual process, how you obtain data, how it's done practically. In the first studies I was involved in was that we took the SwedeVox register, which has been around since 1987, including these patient categories. And we linked these data with national data on healthcare, that's diagnosis, all hospitalizations, that's 95% of all outpatient, specialized outpatient visits, and so on. Procedure codes, all outpatient surgery, inpatient surgery, nationwide. And then drugs, that's outpatient prescriptions only, so nothing given in hospital. But it's everything in nursing homes, because that's actually needs to be prescribed in Sweden, those medications by the doctor, so they are included. Then it's of course the procedure codes and diagnosis, as I said, and mortality, causes of death. We linked those to a database and started to look at different things. For example, we took patients starting oxygen in the home these years, and we looked at the linked data with the causes of death register. And so people could start different time points, and then we follow them up, and we have complete data on vital status, date, and cause of death. And we could then take out as well aggregated national data, rates of death from different causes, and we could compare our death rates with those of the general population in Sweden. So this is not like the healthy people in the population, this is the population. So including also sick people, ill people. And this is we can then calculate, of course, the excess mortality as a standardized mortality rate, SMR, which is the observed number of deaths to the expected. And the expected is if we apply the population death rates per gender, year, and age to our material. For example, for CPD, we would be expecting 6.7 deaths, but we had 1,860, which creates a large excess mortality in our study. So that's the type of thing we could look at, and we could compare between men and women. We then expanded the work together with a brilliant statistician in Uppsala in Sweden. We tried to create the method to account for possible survival bias and confounding by indication and these things by dividing medication exposure, drug exposure in 3-month intervals. So we linked with the outpatient prescribed drug register, and we calculated for each 3-month period the actual exposure. And then from that actual exposure, we calculated the probability of having an exposure, because we also had the hospitalization days, the inpatient days, And during that time, they couldn't be prescribed anything because they were hospitalized, right? So we then calculated what would have been their background probability of having a prescription and so on. And you hear yourself that this is fairly complicated stuff. But that can be done. And we then looked at how this time-dependent exposure to different cardiovascular drugs was associated with mortality. And this is the main outcome of that trial, the study. So this is an observational study then. We could look at different. So in this cohort of people with respiratory failure, beta blockers were associated with an increased mortality. And whether that means that we had insufficiently controlled for disease severity and so on, it's difficult to say, but we controlled for a range of different variables in the analysis, which we got from the Swedish registry, which is really hard to say for me. So, and comorbidity was from the patient registry. And then we also looked at drug prescription, but of benzodiazepines and opioids. And so it was a similar design. We took the patients in the database that had COPD, and for the 3 months before starting oxygen, so this is a baseline for the study, this is the date of starting oxygen therapy. And we calculated the exposure to these drugs, and then we compared groups longitudinally. Endpoints were hospitalization and all-cause mortality. And we adjusted for a number of things. And our thinking was that this should be a really, really high-risk population, right? That's why they were so interesting to study. So our thought was that we would expect to get an increased mortality, increased hospitalization if you're on opioids, if you're on benzo, because then you should be more ill. So that was what we expected. And that was why we tried this hypothesis that low-dose opioids were not associated with adverse events, increased adverse events, which actually we saw that it was not clearly associated with adverse events in form of hospitalization or mortality. Whereas high-dose treatments, and this corresponds to about 30 milligrams per day of oral morphine. So that's how we used the routinely collected data in that analysis. And then we've done studies using cross-linking this register, the oxygen register, with the Swedish Registry of Palliative Care, which was recently published. We had a cohort of patients dying between roughly more than 2 years here in Swedvox. So we took those and then we cross-linked with the palliative care registry, and we had some missing, so about half patients had no data in the palliative care registry. And these patients, their characteristics were similar to the ones that had data in the registry. And we compared that with lung cancer patients, and they were identified actually from the palliative care registry in this study. So it was patients dying from advanced cancer as the main cause of death. And that register covers about 85-90% of people dying from cancer in Sweden. So these were the groups that we compared, and interestingly, the median survival is very, very bad if you got a fibrotic lung disease and you're put on oxygen, if you have progressed to that stage of your disease. So it's a median survival time about 6 months from initiation. If you look at the prevalence, and these are proxy reports, so these are reports from the responsible nurse in most cases. You can see that breathlessness was reported by the large majority of of ILD patients with interstitial lung disease. And overall, the prevalence, as we know, was very high of symptoms in this cohort, both cohorts actually. So that type of analysis we can do. And in that registry, we also have data on the level of relief that was experienced. So the data is from the last 7 days. So which symptoms did the patient at any time during this 7 days experience? So it's fairly rough, it is. And if they experienced this, was it partially, none at all, or fully relieved? And we see that it's breathlessness is, in most instances, only partially relieved. So we've got different data sources. We've touched on the quality registers. We have got the public registries that's run by the government directly. And we've got the study databases, of course. That's regular studies that someone done, like population-based studies somewhere in the country. So if we start off with the quality registers, there was a very good paper, I think, published last year, which I really recommend. And they sent out a questionnaire to pretty much every register in Sweden and obtaining data. And also obtaining the available data from the funding source, which is the government, about each registry. And that is well worth reading, that paper, actually, if you're interested. And you can use then these registries as a single data source, of course. You can combine them, and I will show how we work with that, how we do that. And you can also use them quite freely as a recruitment base, which is done for randomized trials, for example, or observations trials. And they had a graph, rather nice graph, I think, about the number of registries in this for the major disciplines. And you see that it differs. For example, there is a lot of cancer registries. They've really, for a long time, been working really hard. And cardiovascular disease and so on. A lot of areas are picking up on this. So if you look at actually the coverage, so on the y-axis here, you've got the percentage of the target population that is covered by the registry. And here on the x-axis is the starting year of the registry. You see that the bunch that started some years ago, they have actually now a high coverage. And they were probably also selected, when they started, they selected suitable populations. And they started off very small, because you had to do everything on paper back then. And you didn't want so many papers written by doctors, because you never saw what they wrote anyways. So you were very selective. Now we've got very large registries, lots of data, lots of variables, follow-up, visits and stuff. And that's going to be a problem. But the dots here are moving up and down. So some are really climbing, they are improving. And I assume, normally it is like this. You get like a couple of years. You get 3 to 5 years of funding. And then you need to have like around 70-80% of coverage. Otherwise, you're dropped. So it's quite hard work. And talking about the cancer registry, so it was founded in 58. And it's got a very, very high coverage of 96% nationwide. And that's partly because of both the laboratory, that the path laboratory and the clinicians have to report. I don't know what happens with the 4%, but they have some way to elude the government. I don't know what they do. I should learn more about that. And it includes fairly basic data. This is a Swedish social security number. Age, sex, place of residence, of course. The diagnosis type and date of the diagnosis, the type of cancer, histologic type, stage. That's the basic stuff. So this is the basic cancer registry. which I would say is very suitable for identifying all cases of cancer and when they were diagnosed and what type and so on. But if you want to have like physiological data, you want to have more specific data, for example, breast cancer specific data, colon cancer data, then you can actually often get that by combining this data with the INCA registries, which are disease specific. So now we're talking about these 17 different types. For example, lung cancer. And they've got also excellent data actually. And this can also include like genetic tests and biobank and so on. So that's available. And palliative care registry, they've got useful data, I would say, since 2011. Of all deaths, about 60% of all deaths are included, which is fairly high. And more than 85%, now about 90% of people dying with advanced cancer. Last 7 days, proxy, and some unit data, symptoms, level of relief, whether symptoms were assessed with a validated tool, and as needed medication. That's IV or that's parenteral medications. That is based on this questionnaire, which runs page up and page down, which is not mandatory. So these registers, I mean the cancer registry and some infectious disease registries, they are mandatory. It's mandatory under the law to enter that data. But other registries, it's up to the units, actually. So we give them bad conscience, is that the word in English? You know, we call them and say, oh, we're so sorry, you don't do it properly, you know. Oh, we will try to do it better next year. That's how we do. If you have a quality register, how is that actually governed? So the funding is from the governmental body, and it's been very liberal last 4 years. So lots of registries, as you said, have been started, been growing, and it's expected that it will still be liberal, and we will be in good money for maybe 1 or 2 years more, and then it will be cuts, and registries will lose a lot of funding if you are not very good. So, and then we got a responsible authority. So, and that means like a county in Sweden. So a registry is run by a county. And it's often like the place where the first person starting the registry was working, you know. They are responsible. So the thing is about this, that this was a change maybe 5-10 years ago. Before, the researchers, you know, you had this brilliant researcher thinking about we should start this register. She owned the data, right? She could be kind and collaborate with people. That's not the case anymore. So if you got the public funding, then you're under then you're using the social security numbers. Then you're under the Public Access to Information Secrecy Act of Sweden. So actually, if you are registering stuff about people, you need to let people know about that data. And if you request that data, you have the right to get it, unless there is something strange going on. Which everybody doesn't really know in Sweden, actually, because some people think that they can refuse other researchers to get the data. They can do that, but then they need to say, no, you haven't got ethical approval. Things like that. If you got ethical approval, you got a sound research plan, you can get data. So we have this county council, and they say, like, they don't do much. They process the applications, the data requests. And then the registry is still run by, for example, the specialty group, like the College of Physicians in Sweden. They appoint like a steering committee which decides what to do and so on with the register, which data to include. And then they have a close collaboration with the data management unit that implements that in the registry, that checks the data and so on. So that's the different players in this game. And then, of course, the care units, and they report web-based data into the data management unit, which then reports and reports. Then moving on to public registers. These were the quality registries. Public registries also available for everybody after formal data request. And they are all run by the government. And they are actually quite nice to work with, these people, is my experience. And the mortality registry, about 100% coverage. Hospitalizations, diagnosis over 90%. A little less for private psychiatry, for some reason. And 100% outpatient prescriptions. So they've got a standard online process, and I will show that, how to get data. And you will, in most cases, get de-identified data. So you send them your project plan. We want these, based on these criteria, we want these people and so on. And you get people number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 with their age, gender, etc. And they then, of course, saves the key for some years. So you can go back to them and say, oh, something went wrong, or I want to get some more data. Look, I've got ethical approval to get that. And they can work. You can get more data. They can fix an error within that time frame because they've got the key to the social security number. So and this is really a process to get out the data. So you need some time to do this. And I will have 3 different scenarios. So in the first one, we want to just use data from one quality registry, right? And you have your project plan, of course, and then you identify which registry you want to use and who is governing that. You just enter their homepage and look that up, and then you submit straight away to the regional ethics because they take time. You, at the same time, apply to the county council because they don't care about these guys. So they do their ethical process, they do theirs, they do not communicate, and if they approve it, you do all these steps. They never do it. So you get the answer, you go to the registry, and you say, look what I've got. Could I please have this data? Yes, fill in our form. You fill in their form, which is basically the same form. And they start the work. It takes a couple of months. Each step takes about three months here. And then ethics suddenly say, yeah. And then you send it to them, and then you can get out the data. But they can have done the work before, so you can save some time here. And then you get the data. A simpler case, you only want to get aggregated data from a registry or from a governmental registry. Then it's no problem actually, because that is not considered an ethical issue. So you can go directly to the source. In most, the government, this is the Board of Health and Welfare, the symbol. And they give you the data. And you pay for the statistician, hours that they used. Fairly cheap. No ethics needed. This is great. Almost too good to be true. And then it's the combination. You got your megalomaniac plans, your big study. So you want to combine several registries with governmental registries and get out one database to work with. So to start with, it's the same. You have your project, you send it to ethics, and it's only one ethics. So you send it to the ethics committee. This is their general rule. That's in the same area as your registry. So I'm working in southern Sweden, I send it to the southern Sweden ethics committee, right? And they do their thing. And then you send one application to each registry you want to take out data from. Okay. They do their own dance. Then, if they approve, they do, if it's a sound plan, you contact the registries and they start working. And when you get the approval, you send it to each registry. What now happens is that each registry has a database, and that's with the ID numbers, so that's with the security numbers. And that's very sensitive information then, so that you won't be able to get that. So what they will do is that they will send it to the government with the social security numbers, and they will do the linkage. And they will save the key between your numbers and the actual social security numbers, which is fairly good. And they are actually quite good at this. So they also do it in a standardized way, and then you get one database. Yes. So, and they can, of course, combine from different sources like social data, employment data, crime registry, all sort of stuff, fire guns with hospitalizations and what it can be, fire accidents, car accidents. So I would also suggest again to go back to that earlier paper and actually look up, which data items are included in different registries, because so these are fairly well known to you, I think. So I will not go into them, but there are lots of potential advantages with this type of data that we should really take advantage of. And however, there are some potential limitations. So that's of course a bias. And I mean, the bias will not be, in most cases, will be totally unaffected by increasing the sample size, right? It's all these Lancet articles, in 10.5 million people across the world, BMI is associated with something of great interest, but still bias is as active there probably as in a smaller study with a couple of thousand people. So that's a true issue, will always be probably. Data quality, absolutely. Data quality. What we can do, you can validate as well, because you can get out medical records. You can do a random sample. You can ask the healthcare providers, because that's a government as well. Yeah, you can do that. It takes some time. So, but you can actually do it. Compare it with medical records, for example. And I'm not so sure about real-world studies, actually, because in a sense, the data that we get is fairly representative of the real world. But we often want to go after an effect, right? And the effect is out there in the real world. I mean, a randomized trial is also done in the real world. So it's often extremely difficult, I mean, as you know, to determine an effect using this data. A causal effect, of course, because that's not the real world causal effect. So that's a little bit, I'm not so sure about that word actually, the real world. So, given these, what could we do to improve the use of registry data? And the cardiologists have been so kind as to do some groundwork for us. So they did the first registry-based randomized trial. And what they did was that they combined the strengths of having a registry for collecting consent, eligibility, for example, and doing the randomization in the system automatically. So when you have your patient starting oxygen therapy, or in this case having a revascularization for a cardiac heart attack, you enter in real time, you enter the system and it says new patient in the registry, and it says, is this patient eligible? These three criteria. Yes. Has consent been collected? Yes. Okay, give this treatment. That's how it was. And the system saves the allocated treatment, the date, the time, and then follows up, links automatically with mortality, hospitalization, and so on. You get the database. You have to pay a lot of bucks, but you get it. So in this trial, they use the SCAR, the Swedish percutaneous coronary revascularization registry. And they did, okay, this is very, very messy, but what they actually did was that they included 85% of eligible patients, that's patients with ST elevation heart attack in Sweden. And that's about 61 of all patients having that during almost 3 years recruitment period. So that's, I would say that's fairly interesting because in a regular RCT you include maybe 5%, 7% of the target population is eligible, you know, but people are too old, too sick, and so on, too ill to be included. But here they were kept it fairly broad, and they were able. There were lots of sites not participating, so that was the main reason why people were not included actually as well. So there were quite representative cohorts that were randomized, and it was not blinded, and the primary outcome was the mortality after 30 days, which they could collect with complete follow-up, which is good. And they have calculated that the cost was only about 5 to 10% of what a regular RCT would have costed. Is this structure, the RCT, feasible, and would it be interesting to implement it in palliative care, for example? I think so, because it can sometimes be difficult to recruit people and to follow them, and that's fairly efficiently done in this design. And it can be very cost effective if you choose the right questions to test. And we have discussed some of the challenges in collecting the suitable outcomes. And something, because the cardiologists, they were first, and they were a bit lucky because the government really didn't know what they were doing. But now they've realized that this is a new way of doing research that's going to increase in the future. So now we're having a very active discussion about legislation. So new laws and so on. So this hasn't really settled yet, actually, the use of this. We're having a big discussion right now about adverse events, for example. How much must we register in the European adverse event database in a design like this? I mean, clinicians won't be able or willing to do that. You know, that could severely limit the recruitment to the study and so on. So some bits still there to sort out. But we have plans to, and we've got ethical approval now for doing a randomized, registry-based randomized trial using the Swedvox registry of oxygen patients in the home. So, as I said, whether they are eligible, the criteria there are that they are fulfilling the criteria for home oxygen therapy in Sweden. And we know that about 90-95% of Swedish patients do that when they start treatment. So it's very broad inclusion criteria. And we collect the regular written consent at each site. And then they are randomized to 2 different daily durations of oxygen therapy. And then we collect registry data, because the indication for oxygen is actually to prolong survival time. So in this case, it's a fairly good outcome. But we also collect hospitalizations, diagnosis, drugs, and we will send out the questionnaire at 3 and 12 months to collect breathlessness and stuff like that. And we are waiting approval from the regulatory authorities. So we'll see how it goes. We are having a discussion. So, but this is, a possibility, actually, where cooperation internationally is much warmly welcomed.